Hi, welcome to Tales from the Cabin. This is Jeff Ryan. Today I'd like to talk about a truly life-changing adventure that I went on an unbelievable 40 years ago. When I look back on it now, I just can't believe all the time that's passed. But in 1983, a couple friends of mine and I set off to do the Pacific Crest Trail together. And to give you a really quick backstory, the idea fomented when I was in college, and a couple friends of mine and I, college friends, were trying to think of something to do when we got out of school that would be adventurous. And at the time, obviously, with all three of us being from New England, we gravitated toward the idea of doing the Appalachian Trail. I went home that winter for break and happened upon a cover article on National Geographic magazine talking about this trail called the Pacific Crest Trail that went from Mexico to Canada. So a couple years later, graduate from college, go to work. I'm working a warehouse job, packing out orders for a gear company in Maine. And one night I get a phone call from one of those guys, my friend Mick. And he said, do you remember when we were talking about doing the Pacific Crest Trail? And I said, yeah. And he said, let's do it. Let's leave next April. This was in September of '82. So I asked for and got a 6-month leave of absence from work to do the hike. But before we could even go, I had to do a lot of logistical work. So one night, my mom called me, days before cell phones, by the way. She called me on my landline at my apartment and asked me if she could give me a ride to work the next day. And I said, sure. So get in the car and we're driving to work, and she pulls the car over to the side of Route 1 in Yarmouth, Maine. I'll never forget the spot or the conversation. And she said to me, I just have one question about this trip that you want to do. And I said, what is it? And she said, are you doing it because you feel like you have to do it to impress someone, or are you doing it because you want to do it? And I said, because I want to do it. And she said, good. Put the car in drive, pulled back onto the road, and on the drive up to work, she said, your father and I have been thinking about it, and you're going to have to save up some money for the trip. So in order to save rent, why don't you move home until you leave for your trip? The only conditions we have is that after you're done with your trip, you need to fly the nest. And so I agreed to that. And for 6 months leading up to the trip, I dried food, got my hands on a commercial grade food dehydrator, and started drying food from farmers markets. And boy, what a smorgasbord of goodies we had. One big mistake I made, though, was drying 10 pounds of onions as my first foray into food drying at home. Everyone woke up crying in the middle of the night, but I was forbidden from drying onions from there on. But we had set up thanks to my parents, a staging room in the house that was full of boxes that were timed for mailing to post offices along the way. And so we'd get to a post office on the trail and we'd call home and say, please send the next one. They could be a week apart, they could be 10 days. Longest stretch we had was 17 days without a resupply. So on April 1st, 1983, we set off from the Mexican border and started heading north toward Canada. California was far different scenery than we had experienced in New England. I don't think any of us had ever been to California before. The terrain and the challenge were quite something to us. It was completely otherworldly, starting out in the Anza Borrego Desert, and where it was actually colder than we thought it was going to be when we started the trip. The daytime temps were not particularly hot. They were temperate, but things changed. We got up over the San Gorgonio and San Bernardino mountains, which were filled with snow. We had to rope up and use crampons at some points and ice axes, and then would drop down and pack those up deeper into the pack for a walk across desert terrain. Which brings us to the story of today. As I said, we had been acclimating to the desert, but we had one particularly hairy place where we were going to have to depend on the information that we had and our own wits to get water going across the Mojave Desert. For the first part of the trip, the trail mirrored the LA Aqueduct, which comes from Northern California and goes down to Los Angeles to keep residents in water, ideally plentiful amounts of water. And at that time, which was well before 9/11 or any concerns about the sources being contaminated at all, we would walk along the LA Aqueduct, and every few miles there would be an 8-inch or so what I call a manhole cover, but it was not really that size. It was particularly much smaller, about 9 inches, and we'd be able to reach down in and fill our canteens. Well, that went well until we had to leave the aqueduct. Everything was hinging on us getting across this section and getting water along the way. One thing we had going for us is before we even set out to do the aqueduct section, we had come across a couple who had a sign in front of their house offering free water, plentiful amounts of water. So of course we tanked up there. And when we were talking to them, they said that they had gotten a postcard from a couple that we had met earlier on the trail and had gotten ahead of us. And they sent a postcard back and said, of the two sources coming up on that crossing, there was a Butterbret well and a Butterbret spring. And according to the couple, they said, the couple that owned the house, the postcard said that the Butterbret spring was dry, but the well was running. The well was a well-known source. It was actually a cattle rancher's well, which also kept his livestock in fresh water. So we were pretty confident that they would keep that going and in good shape. So we left the aqueduct and we had a long haul to get across, and it was 115 degrees out. And as I said, we were carrying all this winter gear with us for mountaineering because we were going to need to have it with us again shortly to use it when we ascended back up over 10,000 feet. So we didn't want to mail it ahead for just a few days of walking through the desert. So our packs were about 70 pounds without water, and they were heavy. And we were sweating like crazy. We were really fighting the elements, but we knew that this well would get us through. So we started working our way up through Jawbone Canyon, which would lead us up toward the both the spring and the well. And we got to the spring, and it was really hot out, and the spring was full of algae. It was barely running at all, and we didn't want to risk it. I should mention that I was already suffering with some kind of intestinal ailment, and we had been treating our water. We had carried iodine tablets, so you put iodine in the drinking water and it tasted god-awful, but at least in theory there weren't any creepy crawlies in the water. protozoa or anything. Anyway, I was having a horrible time, and I was kind of attributing it to just the fact that it was strange water to me. It was incredibly hot. Maybe my whole body was thrown off. My digestive system certainly made sense. So anyway, we decided not to drink out of that pretty iffy water source. And we knew that the couple that had been hiking ahead of us said that the well was running. So started up through the canyon after we crossed the stream, and it got really, really hot and exposed. It was just Joshua trees and sagebrush and rattlesnakes. And it was also the tread itself, the trail was like beach sand. It was the most horrific hiking terrain imaginable. If any of you have walked above high water mark on a beach, you know how tiring it gets. And it was mile after mile of that. And the tricky part was you could try to walk on the side, which we did, to try to mitigate some of the worst of the beach sand effect. But then you're walking right in the shadow of potential rattlesnake brush. You're walking right along the edge. And even though I had a hiking stick and I was kind of brushing the brush as I went through to make sure that I wasn't going to get dinged by a snake, it was still a lot. So really exhausted and really battling hard. And we had about a quarter of a quart of sickly warm water left. I was the first one to see the well, and I came up to it and I saw this windmill spinning, and I thought, that's it, awesome, there it is, you know. So we get there and I look again, and the shaft of the well is going up and down at the top, but it's broken clean off in the middle. There was no water coming out of the ground. The top of the mechanism was spinning, but there was nothing getting pulled out of the ground. And I looked, and it was just gross. I mean, there was this little pond full of cattle and cattle dung and flies, and there was just no way we were going to drink from that. So we just sat there. We were devastated, number one, but we were in real danger. I won't say that we're on the threshold of death's door, but we were certainly a couple blocks away from it. It was scary. And, you know, no water, 115 degrees, no shade. It was bleak. And so we looked at the guidebook and saw that 6 miles out, the trail came down and crossed a gravel road. And just over the edge of that road was supposed to be a running water source, a spring. So I got second wind. I don't even know. I found a gear that I didn't even know I had up until that point. And I just boogied those 6 miles. It was more beach sand stuff, and I didn't care. I was just hell-bent on that water source. I was going to get there. And I got there first, and I threw my pack down. I grabbed my canteens. I went down over the embankment and found an entirely dry creek bed. There was nothing there. Not even a teaspoon of water. And I didn't know what to do. I wasn't panicking, but I just figured we were in really dire straits. And it's the most harrowing outdoor experience I've had. Not knowing where the life-sustaining water was going to come from. And all of a sudden, I heard the sound of a dirt bike. In fact, 2 of them. And these guys came up the road, and I flagged them down. And I said, "Can you guys take me to some water?" And the guy said, "Sure, hop on the back." So I had the canteens with me, hopped on the back, took one look back where my pack was, and one of my buddies was just getting there, and I yelled I'd be right back. And the guy on the dirt bike, they took me down to this cattle trough, and it was iffy, man. Probably shouldn't have done it, but I was so desperate. First I ducked my head in the thing, just full tank, and splashed my body with water. And then I filled up canteens and chugged as much as I could get down, and filled up my canteens, started walking back. It was a couple miles back to where my buddies were. And fortunately, a park ranger in a truck picked me up and took me back to my buds. And I handed him the canteens. Everyone drank up. And then we walked down to the trough to have a couple hours of just doing nothing but drinking water. And what an experience. As I said, harrowing. It scared the hell out of me. And I'll say this, that after the fact and to this day, my friend Mick and I, who just talked about this trip, sort of leading up to this storytelling of it, he and I agree to this day, we've been in some amazing, amazing wilderness areas. North Cascades, Southern California, East Coast, Northern Minnesota, massive areas. And neither one of us have ever felt more in the wilderness and more exposed than we were in the desert. The conditions are one thing, but the expanse is another. When you're in the trees or on a river, you don't get the sort of view very often of how expansive the area is and how inconsequential you feel. And the desert sure does that to you. You just feel like you're about this high. And the conditions are such that you really shouldn't be there unless you're really careful and really prepared. Big lesson for us was always have a plan B. Even if you think you're well equipped with information, in retrospect, the couple that told us the information, either the couple that wrote the postcard or the couple that disseminated the information to us, had the information backwards. It was the stream that was running, as meager as it was, and it was the well that was broken. And it just sort of brings home the idea that double check, measure twice, cut once, as it were. Same as with information you get out in the wilderness by well-intentioned people. So the next day we got up well before dawn. As soon as we could even see, we started making tracks for the town of Weldon, which was our next food drop. And it was the fastest we'd ever done on the entire trip. We did 16 miles before 12:30 in the afternoon. We got there and got our food drop box and ate at a restaurant and repacked for the next section. I should report that my stomach was not doing any better. It was in fact getting worse, whatever this malady was. And when we left town, after we rested for a couple days, I only lasted a day and a half, and I was so sick that I could only do about 500 yards at a time before I had to drop my pack and get sick again. And finally I realized, in fact, Mick was the bearer of the news to me that, dude, you got to get off the trail and get well. You're holding us back, and you just are not right. And so I got off the trail, and I spent a week in a really cheap hotel in Lone Pine, California, meeting some really interesting characters, getting recharged on yogurt and salad, which ultimately knocked this thing out of me, which to this day I still think was Giardia, the parasite. But I recovered, I rejoined the group, and got to experience some of the best hiking experience, prolonged hiking experience of my life. And we arrived in Canada on September 21st, 1983. Fantastic adventure, of which the story of the Butterbrett Well continues to resonate with me to this day. Thanks so much for joining me. If you like stories like this, please consider becoming a subscriber. It would really help. And also, if you'd like to support me, you can visit jeffryanauthor.com and check out my books. Also, you could buy me a cup of coffee at buymeacoffee.com. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next week on Tales from the Cabin.